you've got the government basically giving an indication that there's not going to be any kind of... Well, they're not going to change their forecasts for Thursday. It seems as though that's going to be the case for restrictions anyway in Melbourne. Given the low case numbers, would you be urging a rethink?
Well, the decision has to be made based on evidence. So I would always urge that the decision is actually based on evidence of efficacy. But, you know, when I speak to people in Victoria at the moment, there is an incredible degree of frustration around the lack of clarity in the benchmarks by which the state is going to outline the end of a lockdown. And I think that the Victorian government owes it to the people of Victoria to be clear about the basis in which they will end the lockdown and then the measures thereafter. That shows both forward planning, but also provides a clear incentive about keeping case numbers down and manageable so people can start to plan their lives, and not just small businesses, though that's important, but of course just average Victorians who have now been through nearly 2 weeks of lockdown.
It just doesn't seem like that many cases, and it hasn't been many cases for several days now. So when we're talking about 4 new cases a day, do you believe that that's significant justification for locking down 5 million people?
Well, the cases that have emerged increasingly seem to be in aged care. Now, that's very worrying for those residents in those aged care homes, and that's random. If there hasn't been significant community transmission with a couple of cases, again, the Victorian government needs to outline the basis in which it is going to keep that many people locked down if there is little community transmission or no community transmission, the basis in which that's going to end. Because I think Victorians want a clear sense of confidence in both the end of the lockdown, but more critically, the state government has control over it so that we don't go into lockdown every time there's 1 or 2 cases.
A lot of the critics have been out this morning suggesting that doomsday language that was used by James Merlino last week, and Sutton as well for that matter. They believe that wasn't warranted. What's your take on that?
Well, I certainly think some of the rhetoric was very, very heavy and inflamed. And, you know, I do accept that there can be new variants, which can be an area of concern for the government as well as for people and the mass spread. But as far as I can see at this point, that hasn't been established. Epidemiologists have been pushing back, saying they haven't seen that. And again, this is why I think the Victorian government has a responsibility to level with the public, both about the degree of the risk, but then the pathway for reopening. Because if there isn't a clear pathway for reopening, it won't be the basis in which people can be confident, not just getting out of lockdown now, but the justification for future ones should that arise. Because I think, frankly, after the 4th, Victorians are kind of over being locked in their homes.
Boy who cried wolf comes to mind here. I mean, is there a danger, Tim, that the next time the government uses this kind of language that people just won't obey it because it hasn't resulted in that many cases?
Well, I want to be cautious. I'm obviously in Canberra, but from when I speak to people at home, it seems increasingly likely that where there are no cases of community transmission, that people are not taking the rules as seriously. Now, if the situation is as serious that you need to lock down 5 million people in their homes to stop the spread of the virus, but they no longer take it with the credibility that it deserves, then it says that there's a trust gap. And that's the state government's issue, ultimately, because they're not taking the people with them. And so I think there is that risk. Mickleham
or Avalon for quarantine?
Well, I just want the site that works best. But of course, Avalon seems to me like a logical choice for the simple reason that you need more services than just the facility for a quarantine facility. You need things like airports, hospitals, access to staff, etc. But I am not the decision maker, and I haven't got the evidence base. But the fact that it has an airport there is an obvious logical point to it.
Well, New South Wales has now put its hand up, and you wouldn't be surprised by that. But do you think it's inevitable that all states and all territories will at some point have their own extra quarantine facility?
I don't think it's inevitable. I think there's a reality where we need some support. We may need additional support depending on how long this pandemic goes for. But I guess I've always looked at the issue of quarantining and said, can we shift our mindset from one that's necessity to one that's opportunity? Where, you know, one of the great strengths of our country is the scale of our continent. Is there a way we can turn around and look at quarantine and say, OK, how do we potentially provide similar services for other countries that want to quarantine their populations? And can we actually turn it into an opportunity exercise rather than just a necessity?
Just finally, your super, your future, it's been watered down just a little. What do you make of that and its chances of getting through the Senate?
Well, the key objective of this legislation is to inject transparency into opaque super funds where they waste hundreds of millions of dollars on bonuses, marketing and advertisements and indulgence on themselves. And we want to get shine a clear spotlight into the legislation. Now, if you need to amend legislation to get it through the Parliament, then that's sometimes a necessary part of our democracy. But the objective has to remain the same, which is your super is your money, it is your future, it is not there for fund managers to take up to $36 million bonuses from, which is what has been occurring and has been shockingly underreported by the media.
Tim Wilson, thanks for your time.
Thanks.